Welcome to autumn, friends. As you may have guessed, it's my favorite time of year. A time that is echoed throughout history with a ritual of sharing otherworldly tales. In honor of that tradition, this month is dedicated to exploring accounts of the supernatural. And what better way to celebrate the thinning of the veil than with a good ghost story? Tonight's tale is a true account of one restless spirit who reached beyond the boundaries of the other side to create some very real-world consequences. I'm DreyOfTheDead, and it's time to feed your head. A former resident of Pocahontas County, Edward Shue was a towering man of strength who had recently moved to Greenbrier, West Virginia to work at the shop of a local blacksmith. There he met the lovely Zona Heaster, and the two fell madly in love. After a brief courtship, the couple married in November of 1896 and moved into a small two-story home. To the neighborhood, their happy union seemed to be the stuff of fairy tales. Just 3 months later, in January of 1897, Mrs. Shue became quite ill, so they contacted local doctor J.M. Knapp, who treated Zona for the next few weeks. Aware that his recovering bride might need some assistance while he was at work, on January 22nd, Edward called upon Anderson Jones, a young boy in the neighborhood, to tend to his wife and perform some chores. When Anderson arrived at the house, he noticed the trail of blood on the front steps. Perhaps Edward had gone hunting. He gave the door a knock. No response. Unnerved, Anderson attempted to open the door and was surprised to find it unlocked. He followed the trail of blood to the kitchen and up to the dining room door. He knocked again. No answer. He opened the door and immediately stumbled upon something at the entrance of the room. Looking back, his blood ran cold. There, stretched out on the floor, eyes open wide, was Zona Shue. He rushed to her side and attempted to rouse her, but found Zona stiff and cold. In a panic, he then fled from the house, yelling across the field to his mother's home, "Mrs. Shue is dead!" Anderson continued running all the way to the blacksmith's shop, where he informed Edward of his wife's state. To this, Edward cried out and started for the house. The young boy continued on until he found Dr. Knapp and pleaded with him to come to the Shue home. When they arrived, they found Zona missing from the dining room. She had been moved to the bed upstairs, her head laid in Edward's lap, as he cried and pleaded with her to come back. Not an unheard of scenario, that is, until you consider that she was dressed in an entirely new outfit. Edward had placed Zona in a dress with a high collar, further secured with a scarf tied into a big bow and topped with a veil. Dr. Knapp immediately examined the woman to determine if there were any signs of life. Even through his efforts to revive her, a distraught Edward refused to release her head or allow the doctor to examine it, snapping at him whenever he tried. Assuming the condition was a result of Zona's prior illness, the doctor made his grim deliberation. "It's an everlasting faint," he said. "Her heart has failed." The next morning, accompanied by her husband and several neighbors, Mrs. Shue's body was taken to her mother's home. She was buried the following day in a small family cemetery. At the funeral, Edward never once left his wife's side and permitted no one to go near the coffin. Not even Zona's own mother, Mary. Even stranger, he placed a folded sheet on one side of her head and a random piece of cloth on the other. This, he said, served to keep her comfortable. After the funeral, Mrs. Heaster couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. She'd never fully trusted Edward, despite having no reason not to. Desperate for answers, she remained in prayer for days, hoping that the truth would finally be revealed. One night, she was startled from sleep by a sound in the room. Peering through the darkness, she spotted something. No, not something. Someone. It was her daughter, dressed in the garment she died in. Just as Zona was about to speak, Mary reached out her hand to embrace her daughter, and the girl disappeared. Had it been a dream, a vision, or something else entirely? The next night, Mary prayed eagerly that her daughter would visit her once again, and to her surprise, her prayers were answered. In fact, Zona visited her mother for the next 3 nights, each time further detailing the circumstances surrounding her death. Confident that she finally had the evidence she needed to expose Edward, Mary notified neighbors and authorities of this newly found information, but was written off as distraught and confused. Fortunately, one person was convinced that Mary's story held weight. Her brother-in-law, Johnson Heaster, set out to speak with Shue, and their conversation aroused further suspicion. He then spoke with Anderson and others who were present when Zona was found, and became convinced of the involvement of foul play. Together, Johnson and Mary consulted with John A. Preston, one of the most brilliant lawyers of his time. Preston had already caught wind of the story, as well as the rest of the country, though he gave it little merit. But after 3 hours of speaking with the Heasters, he decided to take the case on and investigate further. He started by questioning Dr. Knapp, who admitted he wasn't 100% sure of the cause of death, since he wasn't allowed to fully examine Mrs. Shue. The men decided that the only way to know for sure was to exhume the body and perform an autopsy. If nothing else, it would at least serve to provide closure for Zona's heartbroken mother. The next day, they informed Mr. Shue of their plans and asked him to accompany them to his wife's grave. Though Edward vehemently protested, he knew it was happening with or without him, and dared not refuse to be present. As they made their way to the burial site, with little Anderson in tow, Edward muttered to himself the whole way there. "I don't know what in the name of God they're taking her up for. They're not going to find anything." Upon reaching the grave, Preston ordered several neighbors to dig up the coffin. Such a thing had never been done in Greenbrier County. But after much debate and even some threats of arrest, Zona's remains were exhumed and carried to the local schoolhouse. A visibly nervous Edward was forced to remain in the room for the entirety of the autopsy. Dr. Knapp first searched for signs of poisoning, but found none. The autopsy went on for 3 full days before a startling discovery was made. Just as Zona's entity had detailed to her mother, Mrs. Shue's neck had been broken. As Zona's body was returned to its grave, Edward was arrested and taken to the Lewisburg prison, but not before making everybody breakfast. Yes, he literally made breakfast for the entire investigative party, and then announced that he was ready to go to jail. As Shue's trial was not until June, Preston spent the next few months attempting to obtain further evidence of his guilt, as he feared the testimony of Mrs. Heaster would not be enough to render a conviction. On June 30th of 1897, one of America's strangest and most sensational trials began. The tiny courthouse was filled to capacity, with neighbors from all around hoping to testify and hear the details of Mrs. Heaster's supernatural meeting with her daughter. During Preston's opening argument, he informed the jury that the case against Mr. Shu was entirely circumstantial, and that the evidence they'd be presented was unlike anything they'd ever seen. What Mary Heaston had experienced was real, and he could prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt. Dr. Knapp was the first witness. In his testimony, he detailed his post-mortem findings, citing a break in the victim's neck that was unable to be caused by attempted suicide. He revealed that the initial heart failure diagnosis was made as a result of Mr. Shu refusing to allow him a full examination. Anderson also testified to his discovery of the body, and several neighbors attested to Edward's lack of sorrow following the funeral. Finally, Zona's mother made her way to the stand. She spoke of the 4 different visits her daughter had made to her room, how the girl described her own death at the hands of her husband, and how she proved her injuries to her mother by twisting her neck until her head faced backwards. As Mary stated in her daughter's words, "He came that night from the shop and seemed angry. I told him supper was ready, and he began to chide me because I prepared no meat. I replied there was plenty: bread and butter, applesauce, preserves, and other things that made a good supper. He flew into a rage, got up, and came toward me. When I raised up, he seized each side of my head with his hands, and by a sudden wrench, dislocated my neck." When called to the stand, Shu denied every point made by the other witnesses, declaring that he had nothing but love for his wife, and challenged the jury to look into his eyes and still find a guilty man. The jury was not convinced. Edward was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. After this conviction, a mob formed with intentions to hang Edward so that he should suffer the same fate as his bride, but were ultimately persuaded by the sheriff to stand down. Shu served 8 years of his sentence before passing as a result of measles and pneumonia. As we now know, Edward's past had been just as dark as that January day in 1897. He'd had a history of violence and had been married twice before to women who both perished unexpectedly. It seems only fitting that his fate came at the hands of a brutalized spirit who achieved her revenge and made sure he could never kill again. If you enjoyed this strange but true tale, be sure to subscribe and check out previous episodes, covering everything from self-surgery to spiritual possession. You'll love it, I promise. As you may or may not have noticed, I'm ringing in the Halloween season with a new YouTube banner. It was created by an amazing graphic designer by the name of Dave Carender. His work is phenomenal. In fact, he's begun releasing a new graphic tee every day in October, so be sure to check out his work and give him a follow. If you'd like to support the future of these videos, while also enjoying blooper reels and behind-the-scenes footage, consider joining my Patreon. These are just a few of the patrons who make these videos possible. I freaking love you guys. And as always, to everyone watching, be well and stay strange.